Brian had returned to the kitchen to join the conversation. Well, actually, the conversation would now change because of Brian's addition. They were hardly going to talk about Brian behind his back to his face. Bert tried to cover his tracks of the previous conversation from the tracker dogs of suspicion. He made a valiant attempt to feign interest in Brian's work at the university. There was also an element of talking shop just to annoy Ralf. Ralf was telling me about your Icelandic pentangles or whatever. Bert struggled for the right words and failed in the usual miserable fashion. Parameters of correctness weren't important. As long as it goaded Ralf, that was all that really mattered. He tried to cover the tracks of his ignorance from the tracker dogs of mockery and put on an inquisitive face to fool Brian. Are we going to be doing metaphors about tracker dogs from now on? Brian held the leash of his Alsatian of confusion. Apparently we are. Icelandic pentagonals? Bert tried not to let this disdain for the word show too openly. You know, that poetry stuff. Brian was now fooled hook, line and sinker. He understood the mispronunciation and corrected Bert with enthusiasm for the subject. Oh, you mean iambic pentameter. His Alsatian was just as enthused. For a moment I thought you were referring to the little-known Icelandic philosopher Bjorn Gafsnarsson. He suddenly went off on a tangent, and he was impressed to think Bert was such an expert on Icelandic philosophers. I thought to myself, well, he certainly knows his 15th century. Ralf had been dismayed by the direction of this conversation to begin with, and he certainly didn't want Brian waffling on in an even worse direction. He put up his hands to silence Brian with his chihuahua of boredom. He was still mindful of his upcoming strategic negotiations. He did it as politely as he could, including a doggy biscuit of possible placation. No, he meant the pentameter stuff. Brian didn't notice Ralph's dismay and became even more enthusiastic. He fell right into Bert's trap and started talking about one of his favourite subjects. Perhaps it was Ralph's fault for mentioning it in the first place. Brian focused on Bert and was totally oblivious to the grimace on Ralf. Oh, well, you've come to the right person then, I can tell you. Ralf tried to lead Brian's tracker dogs directly to his grimace, but they were too busy hunting down Bert's feigned enthusiasm. Yes, we've nearly finished that little book of French verse, haven't we, Ralf? Brian suddenly turned towards Ralf in expectation of enthusiasm at the prospect of this little tome. Ralf wanted to grimace openly at Brian in response, but considering his conniving circumstances, he felt he should maintain his facade of friendliness. He quickly hid his grimace under the prison uniforms that had been discarded by the escapees and donned the apparel of fascinated interest. He would have nodded and smiled, but that would have been going too far. This pretend fascination only served to enthuse Brian even more. He turned back to Bert with a look of joy on his face. I could relate a couple of them to you if you like. He quickly tried to head off any misgivings they might have had at this suggestion. The English translation, of course. Bert suddenly regretted mentioning it now. He regretted ever having met Brian, in fact. Oh, well, Behind Brian's back, Ralf could be seen giving Bert a slight smirk of sadistic pleasure at the sight of Bert's sudden regret. This was, however, tinged with a dismayed look of, now look what you've done. Bert feigned interest again. Oh, of course. He then looked over the top of Brian's head at Ralf to give him a look of, yes, I have done it, haven't I? Brian didn't notice these looks, as he was too busy being enthused at the prospect of some 5 metrical word couplets. Well, that's sort of what it says in the dictionary. He suddenly gave a look of warning as if about to screen an episode of South Park to a children's picnic. But I must warn you, they do get a bit saucy at times. His raised eyebrows went up and down in quick succession to indicate the level of sauciness that might have been encountered. Bert didn't know much about poetry, but he did enjoy a bit of sauce. He suddenly became a little intrigued and liked the sound of this. Ooh. Ralf also liked sauce, but he also knew about poetry. Well, he'd practically been forced at gunpoint to learn about it. He knew what flavour the sauce was and greeted this proposition with scepticism. He could have openly retorted that it was going to be less a bottle of sauce and more like a sachet instead. Under the conniving circumstances, he chose not to mention it, lest it upset Brian and their delicate balancing act of mutual benefit. All he did say was a rather nonplussed, Bert looked on expectantly as Brian looked up at the ceiling and tapped his chin and thought, now let's see, how does that one go? Bert ramped up his look of expectation in the hopes of being affronted by the rude crudity of Brian's pronouncement. He leant in close to Ralf. It was adapted from the original French, so it has to be rude. Ralph gave Bert a look that tried to tell him not to bother wasting good facial expressions on tasteless sauce. Bert's tracker dogs had found the scent that Ralph had left and quickly found his look of don't botherment. Bert was well attuned to Ralph's facial expressions and understood immediately. He inferred the sachet-sized portion of sauce without it needing to be made explicit. His expectation suddenly fell off his face and was replaced by the source of all disappointment. Brian ignored Bert's comment and was not well tuned to reading facial expressions. His tracker dogs were off sniffing those discarded prison uniforms, and so it no helped him at all. He continued his enthusiasm as he suddenly recalled what he had been searching his memory banks for. It was less a quick lycra-clad jog down memory lane, and more like a brisk stroll in Second Empire silk pantaloons. The Second Empire in France was from 1852 to 1870, when Napoleon III ruled. That should give you some idea of how old Brian's trousers were. He donned his pantaloons and adopted a bit of a dramatic pose in order to impart the full sentiment of his poem onto Bert. To seek, to find, to see what lies beneath. There was a sudden hint of lust on his face from the exclusive spring range by Smells Are Us. Brian gave Bert a bit of a visual aid by baring his teeth and making a frenetic tearing gesture. To tear her nether garments with my teeth. Whether it was pantaloons or nether garments, Ralph was hardly filled with lust at this. He was filled instead with dismay. He once again tried to be as polite as possible. Yeah, okay, Brian. Don't want to be talking shop all day, do we? Brian didn't notice the dismay and was not offended in the least. He maintained his seemingly perpetual state of enthusiasm. Oh, right you are. Brian wasn't going to abandon his poetry recitation without leaning over to give Bert the full benefit of his expertise. Mind you, the English is not a patch on the original French version. Bert tried to feign interest, but failed. It was enough to fool Brian, but not anybody else. Brian's slightly suggestive gesture didn't really help. It does tend to lose some of its erotic potency in the translation. Bert really wasn't too sure how to react to that, but gave Ralph an aside of bemusement. Bit of garlic sauce on that one. Ralph returned with a hint of mock seriousness. Oh, indeed.